I'm Andy Kaufman, host of the People and Projects podcast. Welcome to my free video series entitled 20 Ways to Radically Improve Your Ability to Deliver Projects. As Mark Horstman of the Manager Tools podcast has said before, project management eventually comes down to who does what by when. And when you do a WBS or work breakdown structure, you don't really figure out the who and the when. It's mostly figuring out the what. You have to eventually do sequencing, is what PMI would call it. Figuring out in what order are we going to do these activities. Now it seems obvious that you have to do this, but what I find in practice is a lot of times project managers don't sufficiently think through their sequencing. Now what would be the downside of that? This is what I found, is if you don't think through your sequencing thoroughly enough, what happens is the horizon that you're managing is shorter. It's Monday and we're thinking through, all right, what are we gonna do this week? And then the next Monday, what are we gonna do this week? Where if you do a good job of sequencing, you have a longer horizon, you have a better idea of what are we doing a month from now or 2 months from now. Now, of course, projects don't go the way they're planned. So you go through sequencing, understanding it won't go that way. One of the best guys I ever had on my staff, a guy by the name of Bill Henry, who said the project schedule is the schedule for exactly how the project will not occur, okay? So I get that. But there are advantages to doing this, because if you understand that this is how we think it's gonna go, then when it comes to negotiating for resources, we have a better idea for when we're gonna need those. Also, when you look through your sequence, you can get an idea of where is it that we're doing things in parallel, where is it that all those things come into one point where there's often more risk there. Also, sequencing allows you to understand your critical path. And so there's a lot of advantage of that. This is what I find. Sequencing is one of my least favorite things to do. Of all the stuff we're talking about this series, not because it's not important, it's hugely important, but it's difficult. It's difficult because you're trying to represent in a tool what's really gonna happen. And in practice, we're not doing just this one thing, we're doing multiple things. And so there's this balance, this tension between having too much detail, and if you have too much detail, it becomes a project to manage the project, but having just enough detail that you can control your project. Okay, a couple quick points on critical path. I find a lot of practicing project managers don't really use or maybe even understand critical path. You know, what is it that critical path actually means? I said to a guy once at a company, he goes, critical path tasks, that's the task I don't want to be assigned to. He knew it was critical, he knew it meant that there was a lot of pressure, but what is it really? Is it just what's most important to me? Is it what's most important to the boss? Well, as it turns out, it's not a subjective thing, there's actually a calculation behind it. And it's a series of tasks that have no float. Basically, there's no float. If this is allocated to 5 days and it takes 6 or 7, it's going to slip. That's the idea behind it. Well, this is what I find, is in practice, people don't pay attention to it. And so it's worth looking through. What is your critical path? In fact, here's a practical example that I find is helpful. Do you ever have people in different parts of your business who you depend on, and yet they don't have the same sense of priority, same sense of urgency as you need? Well, yeah, it happens all the time. Well, let's say that it's a task that they need to review and sign off on some sort of document. And let's say it's on the critical path. What I've learned to say is, you know what, you don't have to get back to me today. This is allocated out to 5 days, but I want you to know, since it's on the critical path, that if it takes you 6 days instead of 5, our project's gonna slip by a day. Now, why is that potentially a helpful conversation? Well, you know what, this is what I find. If I just say it's on the critical path, they don't get it. But if I say, if it takes you 6 days instead of 5, our project's gonna slip by a day, this is what I find, is often we communicate why something is important, but we don't communicate the consequences of inaction. And there are a lot of people, on a practical basis, the way they run their week is, what's the biggest fire? Oh, this is, I'll put that one out, and they bounce from fire to fire to fire to fire. Well, it could be that they didn't understand how big a deal this really was. And this might be just my worldview, but this is what I find, is that a lot of times they maybe don't even want to do it, but they don't want to be the reason why something's going to be delayed or be late. And so that's something that you can potentially use to your benefit. There's lots of benefit of understanding critical path. And what I find is if you protect your critical path, and you can only do that if you do sequencing, that's how you understand your critical path. And when I say protect it, what I mean is you look at your critical path. Do my estimates look good? Are my resources gonna be available? Am I dependent on any materials or anything external to the project? If you protect that critical path, you can radically improve your ability to successfully deliver your projects. Hey, take a minute to visit us online at freeprojectmanagementvideos.com. You'll get exclusive access to our free video series entitled 20 Ways to Radically Improve Your Ability to Deliver Projects. We'll see you there.